The polymerase chain reaction, or PCR test, is very unpleasant and often painful. The nasal swab is a wooden or plastic stick that's inserted into the patient's nose to reach the nasopharynx area. This hasn't gained much traction, but it's not something anyone really looks forward to. It's also criticised for being too slow. It was not designed to detect SARS-CoV-2. It may detect inactive viruses or viral fragments, but a serious criticism is that it's too sensitive. Well, what does that mean? Approximately 90% of people testing positive in 3 American states had such a small amount of virus in their systems they were completely asymptomatic, according to the New York Times. PCR tests work by splitting an RNA strand from a sample and adding a primer to create what's called a polymerase chain reaction, hence the name. You need to run this cycle repeatedly to be able to measure any kind of viral load, and this works geometrically, so in essence it doubles each cycle. After 10 cycles you have 1,024 times as much as when you started. After 20 cycles you have just over 1,000,000 times as much as when you started. After 30 cycles, you get 1,000,000,000 times as much, and after 40 cycles, you get 1,000,000,000,000 times as much. So the question becomes, where do you draw the line? At what cycle, known as the amplification rate, do you stop and declare someone has tested negative? InfectiousDiseaseAdvisor.com has stated that there is a very strong inverse relationship between infectivity and the cycle threshold value. This is known as the CT value. This makes sense because if you need to amplify something 1,000,000,000 times to get a meaningful reading, it's very likely the person isn't infectious. In fact, once a sample has been cycled 34 times or more, they aren't considered to be infectious, according to the European Journal of Clinical Microbiology and Infectious Diseases. In the laboratory, cell culture infections are seen as the gold standard of testing. Between 13 and 17 iterations, researchers almost always get a positive result when infecting cell cultures, but only 12% of samples were infected at 33 iterations. Samples which needed to be cycled 34 times or more to test positive did not infect cell samples. This is likely because the initial viral load was insufficient to be infectious. So the question is this. Whenever you see a media report saying more people test positive, second wave, etc., is the CT value ever reported? If it's not, the figure is essentially meaningless. If you put a sample through enough iterations, you'll get a positive sample eventually. We must be told the CT values of these positive tests, otherwise the figures can be manipulated to the point of meaninglessness. This is not good. If a politician or public health official wanted to, they could simply order all the tests to have a CT value of 40. You could practically guarantee an increase in positive cases if that's what you wanted. You'd get a headline, you'd frighten people, you could justify any freedom-crushing measure you wanted, but it would be a lie. And we've had enough fear and propaganda. We need truth. And the start of this? Ask the CT values of positive tests every single time. Without this, the figures are essentially meaningless. If you like this, please like, recommend, and subscribe.